Welcome to the podcast for History and Theories of Psychology, brought to you by Victoria University, produced and presented by myself, Paul Duffett. This is the unit where we look at the historical context of psychology from the early 20th century right through to today.
It's one small step for man.
Shut up and sit down.
One giant leap for mankind.
And greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right.
Every 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
This is our podcast for Teaching Week 4. So this week we're talking about behaviorism. And the content for this week is, first we'll look at J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. These were the key figures in the school of behaviorism. And we'll continue to make some reference to the social upheavals at the start of the 20th century. But this week we're going to make some more reference to the scientific paradigms that were dominant at that time, and particularly the shift in the paradigms in psychology, specifically the hegemony of positivism. Hegemony just means a sort of all-encompassing power. You're in a hegemonic system when you can't imagine not being in that system. For example, capitalism. Many people can't imagine an alternative to capitalism these days, and that's a pointer to capitalism being a hegemonic system. Anyway, let's move on and let's ground this week into our unit learning outcomes. And as with the previous week, we're going to stay focused on those 3 learning outcomes that are linked to the Essay 1. By the end of Teaching Week 4, you should have all you really need in order to begin to start drafting that essay. And we're going to have a full seminar meeting in week 5 where you can fully discuss your ideas for that essay. Just to recap on that essay, for this podcast, the keywords that we're going to focus on are history, obviously. The whole unit is about history. But we're going to focus on behaviorism. And we'll give you some material that you can link to the first activity, which is coercive interrogation in the War on Terror, and also to that second activity, which is psychology's involvement with the treatment of mental illness. Now, when you write your essay, you want to restrict the bit of history that you are looking at. At this stage, we're not really looking at the social movements so much. We haven't really talked much about those, and we'll look at those in much more detail, particularly when we get to the era of the 1960s and 1970s and start looking at that shift towards cognitivism, but also a shift in psychology towards critical theory. But for this essay, you want to be picking up the key historical events in relation to war, industrial revolution, and capitalism. You can take a fairly broad brushstroke to all of this, so we're not expecting you to include an awful lot of detail on those historical events, but just giving a broad picture, really, of what was happening in society at the time that these schools were dominant or becoming dominant. Now, for psychoanalysis, the period you really want to be focusing on is the 1900s through to the 1920s. And for behaviorism, you want to be looking at the 1920s through to the 1950s. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So it's behaviorism. And behaviorism was dominant between the 1920s and 1950s. It stayed dominant right through to the 1970s, but we're going to stick with 20s to 50s. For this podcast. And that was the time when Western society was really fully immersed into the Second Industrial Revolution, and it was the aftermath of the Great Depression. And it was a period where the political economic environment was shifting towards Keynesian economics, where there was a belief that the state needed to control human behavior in a way. We couldn't just all be free and do whatever we wanted. The state had to intervene into our lives to keep everything safe and equal and make sure that the resources were shared between members of the state. Now, let's have a look at behaviorism, and let's have a look at those early days before it rose to dominance. And we have people like Edward Thorndike and Ivan Pavlov. They were seen as the founders of the behaviorist school of thought. I won't spend an awful lot of time on these guys, but it's just worth recapping what they were up to at the time they were working. So this was late 1800s, early 1900s. Edward Thorndike experimented mostly with chicks in a maze. The chick got better at finding their way through a maze to find food and water and to find other chicks. And Thorndike didn't see this as a sign that chicks were intelligent, but he saw it as a sign that chicks were reacting to the promise of the reward of food and water and the company of other chicks. And this was the initial interest in behavioral psychology starting. Next we've got Ivan Pavlov. He developed laws of conditioning that really sat at the heart of behaviorism. And his program of laboratory experiments with dogs became known as Pavlov's dogs. So the key thing to remember about that work was it was all done on animals. So both Thorndike and Pavlov based their theories on their laboratory experiments with animals. The experiments were quite ingenious, and they were also very mechanized. They were automated processes. And this was very much a product of the time, with the fascination with mechanization. And this fascination was coming from the developments through the first into the second industrial revolution of the mechanization of factories. Now let's look at John B. Watson. He's one of our key figures here, and we're going to spend a bit more time talking about him because he is considered to be Mr. Behaviorism. Watson's success was based on the behaviorist view of psychology as a purely objective and experimental branch of the natural sciences. And for Watson, the goal of behaviorism was the prediction and control of behavior, which was the very thing that psychologists felt psychoanalysis could not deliver. So for behaviorism, there was little use in exploring people's minds, their emotions and their desires and their drives. Rather, the object of inquiry for behaviorism was behavior. And Watson attributed most human behavior to a process of stimulus-response conditioning. So just the sort of thing that was happening in the laboratory settings of Thorndike and Pavlov. He, like behaviorism in general, adopted the view that there was no meaningful division between man and animal. So Watson famously said that there was no distinction between man and brute. Now, at this point, I'm kind of wondering if your thoughts might be wandering over to the essay, because if you think about it, there's a connection here to one of the activities that we're focusing on for the essay, and that activity is coercive interrogation. Now, if there's no difference between man and brute, it kind of legitimizes you treating people as brutes, to dehumanize them, treat them as dogs. Human behavior is just the same as dog behavior, really, the basic principles. So it kind of leads you to perhaps treat people like dogs. If you remember back to those awful pictures released on the treatment of prisoners in Abu Ghraib, the prisoners being pulled around on dog leashes, for example, that first sight that the public got of the sort of torture that was happening, undertaken by, in this case, the US Army on Iraqi prisoners, but also UK Army. You can see how there was a legitimacy in behavioral theory in regards to treating people as brutes. So I'll leave you to take that up in your essay if you wish, but there is a connection there which you can start exploring. Now, behaviorism became favoured in psychology largely because it could construct psychology along the lines of what was seen as a truly scientific approach. It could base psychology on observable and measurable events. And the frustration that was felt by some in regards to psychoanalysis being that it was based on things you couldn't observe and you couldn't measure. It was just purely down to the interpretation of the therapist in regards to what was happening in people's heads. This was seen as an answer to that, to shift away from that. Now let's go back to Watson and consider one of his more famous experiments, the Little Albert experiment. And there's a bit of a video I'll just play you, and you can watch more of the video later. I'll put the link up in the podcast notes for you. So if you're just listening to this as an audio broadcast, you'll just hear the sound effects. Obviously not get the images, so you might want to have a look at this video at some point.
Experience. He would make a hissing noise and observe the results. Watson learned that newborn babies had no fear of the dark. He also learned, however, that such fear could be conditioned.
Now that video was featuring John B. Watson, and it also featured Rosalie Rayner, his assistant. I'll get back to Rosalie because she figures in the story of John B. Watson quite importantly. Now the baby in that video was known as Little Albert. Now I want you to think about that video in relation to how fear was being highlighted in the video. And there is a link again to the management of fear in relation to war propaganda. So there's a link into our previous podcast where we just considered links between psychoanalysis and the machinery of war through propaganda, and there were some links there with Bernays and his involvement with the marketing industry and so on. The links are there also for behaviorism, about behaviorism as a means of managing fear, and one of his most famous experiments was about inducing fear in poor little Albert. You also might have noticed that the video has a soundtrack that might also make you think that something a little evil might be happening in that experiment. It's not an experiment that psychology is awfully proud of these days. It's seen as morally problematic, but we'll pick up that point later in this podcast, but also a little later in the unit when we consider generally whether psychologists might actually be the bad guys. Now, I just want to sum up at this point behaviorism in regards to the way it sees human behavior and the object of its inquiry, human behavior, the way it viewed human behavior in animalistic terms, but it also started to develop a theory of mind where mind and behavior operated very much like machinery. It didn't actually matter what was going on in people's heads. There was kind of automatic processes going on. And this model of mind and model of human behavior developed, which very much equated human nature as a machine, that we just automatically responded to stimuli present in our environment. And there were laws in regards to how we would respond to those stimuli. Again, we'll pick that up a little later. Now let's just move on to B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner was, as you know, a leading behaviorist. He was known as a neo-behaviorist. Neo-behaviorists believed that the study of learning should be rigorously objective and use observational methods. And it believed this because it thought that this would be the key to making psychology scientific. And Skinner is best known for a form of learning which is called operant conditioning. He's also known for that notion of schedules of reinforcement. He's known for the Skinner box, and he's also known for his utopian novel called Walden 2. Skinner had a huge influence in psychology, and his ideas are still widely used today in psychological research, still widely used today in education, and also widely used today in psychotherapy, which might surprise you given how much behaviorism has fallen out of favour in regards to psychology. It's hard to find a behaviourist these days in psychology departments. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Skinner's life, because he's an interesting figure, and I'm not just referring to his enormous forehead, though that was interesting and considerable. His life story was actually really interesting. Skinner was born on March 20th, 1904 in the small town of Pennsylvania, where he also grew up. His father was a lawyer. His mother stayed home to care for Skinner and his younger brother. And at an early age, Skinner showed an interest in building gadgets and contraptions. He was a little gadget man. Skinner went to school at Hamilton College, and that's where he developed a passion for writing. He wanted actually to be a poet and a novelist, but he could never find success with that. And it was whilst he was working on his novel writing and his poetry writing that he started working in a New York bookstore. And it was there that he discovered the works of Pavlov and Watson. And he became intrigued and excited by that work. The works of Pavlov and Watson inspired him to get an education at Harvard University. And it was whilst at Harvard University that Skinner became a famous psychologist. Now, as a writer, his poems were regarded as pretty damned awful, largely because the characters in his stories and in his poems failed to convince his readers that they were actually real people, rather than just fictitious constructions. His characters came across as quite empty and almost robotic. And you could say, and this has been said, that Skinner did what he did in psychology so that he could change the nature of people to fit with his characterization of people in his writings. It has been said, but little fanciful there. But it's still an interesting observation about, I suppose, his lack of ability to be successful with creative writing, because he couldn't show an understanding of human nature, and in psychology he achieved great success, and you could say it's largely because of his lack of understanding of human nature. Okay, let's go back to his life. And when he was at Harvard, he did his PhD studies, and he received his PhD in 1931, and he remained in Harvard until 1936, and that's when he married Yvonne Blue, and then he moved to Minnesota, and he began teaching at the University of Minnesota. The couple had 2 daughters, Julie and Deborah. Now, Harvard was the place where Skinner did most of his inventing and where his fame really grew. It's where he invented the Skinner box. Now, Skinner was a very loving father, but this was questioned when he showed off one of his new inventions, which was called the baby tender. This was an alternative to the crib. It was a crib that was heated, and so reduced the need for blankets, and it was believed blankets could suffocate a child. And the crib also had plexiglass, had a window in it, and this was instead of bars, iron bars, and this was so that the limbs of the child wouldn't get trapped between the bars. So it was all seen as a very safe environment in which to place the child. Now, it had an unfortunate look to it. It was a kind of a big box with a window in it that you just put your baby into. And the baby tender, Skinner developed it to sell. It wasn't a commercial success. People didn't like the idea of putting their babies into a box. I think he only sold around about 300 of these cribs. But there's a legacy that was left with this baby tender, and it's a legacy where critics confused the baby tender with the Skinner box and believed that what Skinner was doing was experimenting on his daughter, because he used this crib for his daughter. His daughter spent 2 years in this baby tender. So critics saw Skinner as a rather heartless father who just experimented on his daughter. That it's just all rumour, there's no proof of this. It's hard to imagine that he would have done such a thing, but it's a very difficult rumour to kick, that he was somehow a rather callous, cold, unfeeling father. Everything suggests that actually he was a very loving father. But perhaps it's the first signs that something was awry with the Behaviorism project, because people didn't like the idea of seeing people subjected to these behavioral principles in action. Now, and there was another invention that Skinner was known for, and this was called Project Pigeon. This was in early 1942 during World War II, and Skinner designed a missile guidance system using pigeons. Now, I'm not joking, try not to fall over laughing, but he did invent a missile guidance system based on pigeons. The US National Defense Research Committee actually funded the work, and it was called Project Pigeon. So this invention entailed 3 pigeons being tucked into a guidance system. The 3 pigeons would face a screen. There'd be an image of the target projected onto that screen through a lens system in the nose of the missile. And there would be crosshairs, and pigeons would peck at the screen, peck at the crosshairs, and the screens were wired up to provide feedback to the missile's flight controls. The pigeons were trained with slides of aerial photographs of the target. So this missile would be flying over, and the pigeons were trained to, when presented with an image of, for example, a ship in the ocean, little ship, if they pecked at that figure of the ship, that they would get rewarded by grains deposited in a tray in front of them. Now, Skinner demonstrated his invention in New Jersey to a group of army officials, and Skinner got bitterly frustrated to see that all it inspired in the army officials was amusement. And Project Pigeon was abandoned, and it was never used. Now, whether the idea was practical or not, it appears that Skinner, as an academic psychologist, wasn't really on the same wavelength as industrial engineers or military officials that he was trying to work with. He didn't really manage to communicate very effectively with him. But the behaviorist principles and the behaviorist ideas upon which his work was based was actually taken up by the military. It was, and it still is, used by the military. For example, this is particularly strongly in military training, because the army needs to train, particularly during wartime, a lot of people very quickly, and those people might have poor educational backgrounds, conscripts, and those recruits have to be trained to undertake complex tasks under incredible pressure of the battlefield, to operate increasingly sophisticated military equipment. Now, as I said earlier, B.F. Skinner and the neo-behaviorists were particularly interested in education, and they were focused on improving methods of learning. And you can see this by, for example, the invention and promotion of such contraptions as the teaching machines, which were thought could improve education in schools. I'll just show you a little clip here, and I'll put a link to the YouTube video in the podcast notes to Skinner talking about his new invention, the teaching machine, which would assist school children to learn more effectively based on the principles of operant conditioning.
Is that each student follows a carefully constructed program, leading from the initial stage where he is wholly unfamiliar with the subject to a final stage.
Now, his views, the views of Skinner on learning, were quite extreme, all based on this theory of operant learning. Skinner stayed true to his extreme behaviorist, this kind of reductionist approach to seeing every human behaviors purely based on stimulus-response conditioning, and he stuck to it all his life. He thought that mind, thought, memory, and reasoning didn't exist. They were just words, or they were just verbal constructs. And he didn't believe they were suitable objects of inquiry for behaviorism. Skinner's goal was not to understand the human psyche. His goal was to work out how human behavior can be created or changed by external causes. He believed psychology's proper object of inquiry was human behavior, and the proper method of inquiry was through the laboratory experiment. He was absolutely convinced he was correct, and he didn't believe that his views needed to be argued with. Now, Skinner, as I mentioned earlier, always wanted to be a novelist and a writer, and in 1948 he did write a novel. It was called Walden 2. And this novel proposed a type of utopian society. And in this society, people were led to be good citizens through programs of behavior modification, through systems of rewards and punishments. The novel really set out his broad vision for behaviorism as becoming the defining theory of human nature which could help organize society. Now, Skinner lost a bit of credibility amongst some of his academic colleagues when he published this novel, because he was now dabbling in the realm of fiction, using the vehicle of novels, and fiction and all that went with it was disparaged by modern psychologists, as they equated all of that stuff with psychoanalysis and with a non-scientific psychology. But not everyone was a die-hard experimentalist in psychology. Not everyone had shifted over to this notion of science being the thing that happens in laboratory settings. Some were still committed to alternative ways of doing science, and for those people, they questioned Skinner's focus on a very myopic scientific approach, very short-sighted, very reductionist view, and felt that his approach to science didn't capture the essence of human existence. Now, while many of his behavioural theories have fallen out of favour these days, Skinner's identification of the importance of reinforcements remains a critical discovery, and he believed that positive reinforcement was a great tool for shaping behaviour. This idea is still very much around with us today. There's another little video, and again I'll just show, just be a little clip playing here, and I'll put the link to the YouTube video up in the podcast notes. Just another video, this time showing Skinner working with his gadgets, with these increasingly sophisticated mechanical devices that he was using to do his experimental work. Now, I want to return to John B. Watson. This is another very interesting part of the story too, and we're just going to look at a bit of his life, because it helps to draw out another one of the connections between behaviorism, this time the connection between behaviorism and the industrial commercial sector. Watson was actually fired from Johns Hopkins University, where he worked. He was fired from university in 1920, and he was fired because he had an affair with his research assistant, Rosalie Rayner. Remember that woman in the video I referred to? The video we just watched a little earlier about the little Albert experiment. Now, after getting fired because of having that affair, he began working with one of the biggest advertising agencies in New York City at the time, which was J. Walter Thompson's on Madison Avenue. It was very well paid, very lucrative. And Watson enacted his behaviorist theories into marketing techniques. Now, in one of his advertising campaigns, which he created for Johnson & Johnson, that manufacturer of baby powder, for example, he evoked the idea of purity and developed a marketing campaign that would link purity with the product. And he also linked the dangers of infection to infants to not using the product. And here what he was doing, the marketing campaign, was stimulating a fear response on the part of young mothers. So he bargained that mothers would doubt their competence in dealing with their baby's hygiene, and they'd be frightened that they could endanger the health of their baby if they didn't use Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. Now, based on the behaviorist theory, the marketing industry was given the tools by which they were told they could manipulate consumers and they could manipulate the emotional response of the consumer. So advertisers were given from behaviorism the tools that were purportedly able to control how consumers felt about a product. And it was primarily through the manipulations of emotion. So using music, using children, using comedy, using drama, using authority figures, using brilliant actors, basically using any type of influence that they could find, particularly from the growing industry, the cinema industry, which was developing at that time. It was a very effective medium to evoke emotions in audiences. So emotions were seen as responses that could be conditioned by behavioral principles. Now, there's another YouTube video, a link I'll put up, which is showing a award-winning advert. It's about 3 minutes long, this advert, and I won't play it in this podcast, but you can have a look at it. Just look in the podcast notes. And it's a brilliant advert, but it so manipulates your emotions. It really does tug at your heartstrings. Well, it did tug at mine. So I'd be interested to see if it tugged on yours too. That's the end of part 1 of this podcast, and we'll pick up where we've left off in part 2, which you can download from VU Collaborate.